Dirty Bird podcast contains foul language and is not appropriate for young fledglings. Listener discretion is advised. Our intro music is brought to you by Ricky Pistone, aka Dick Piston. And our outro music is brought to you by the Sidewalk Slammers. Check them out wherever you get your music.
Are you looking for a podcast today with ornithology and humor you crave? Well, I know all these guys and it's birds they like. It's Dirty Bird, yeah, they're just a couple guys who really like birds. It's Dirty Bird, yeah, they're pretty dirty, but they really like birds.
Hello, and welcome to Dirty Bird Podcast, a podcast that's serious about birds, but nothing else. I'm Dr. John, and in each episode I pick an individual bird species and tell you everything you need to know about them. I often record outside. I'm recording outside today on a beautiful April spring day in some woods in Buchanan, West Virginia. There's lots of bugs, there's lots of birds. Hopefully we hear the topic of today's episode, the hairy and downy woodpecker. Thanks to Ange for suggesting this episode. Ange sent me a message on Instagram at Dirty Bird Podcast, talking all about her favorite woodpeckers, especially the downy. She has a suet feeder, and she's become very familiar with a downy woodpecker pair who are used to her presence and let her get pretty close to observe. She's actually named them Jack and Meg, after Jack and Meg of the White Stripes. She even shared a really cool photo from the White Stripes album Icky Thump, where Jack and Meg White are wearing pretty fabulous white and black outfits with red accents, totally inspired by, the woodpeckers of the family that the Downy and Hairy belong to. In the background is what looks like a taxidermied great spotted woodpecker. That totally matches their outfits. The great spotted woodpecker looks a lot like a Downy and Hairy woodpecker. And we'll talk about the whole evolutionary relationships between the woodpecker families later on in the show. But first, let's start off with this week's Birdwatch. We're hearing again from Cass, great friend of the show, Cass, who sent in this Birdwatch. Thanks, Cass. I love crows, too. They're out there murdering. Obviously, I was a little behind on that bird watch. It is now spring, and Cass sent me that in winter time. But y'all, send me your bird watches. Send me, preferably some kind of voice memo or something like that. You can send it to the email dirtybirdpodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at dirtybirdpodcast. Let me know what you're seeing out there, and I'll play it on the show. So let's start off with just describing these awesome woodpeckers. Both the hairy woodpecker and downy woodpecker look very similar. They are covered in black and white plumage that streaks along the head, and then mostly they're black along the body with white spotting on the wings. Females tend to have more of these white spots than males. There's a white stripe along the spine of the back, and the underparts are also white. The males have red on the very back of their head, as if somebody hit them on the back of the head trying to knock them out and now they're bloody. They also may have a little bit of red on the feathers around their bill, kind of like a red mustache. There's a few woodpeckers out west that look very similar to hairies and downies. The only woodpecker in the eastern U.S. you might get them mixed up with is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. It can be a little difficult if you're looking at a female or at a distance to tell them apart, but at least with the males, the difference is pretty easy. The yellow-bellied sapsucker is going to have a dagger-like stout bill to help separate it from the slimmer bills of the hairy and downies. And also the male yellow-bellied sapsucker has red on the front of its head above its bill, and also it has a red bib, not at all like the very back of the head red on the downy and the hairy. Out west, the ladder-backed woodpecker is easily differentiated by the black and white vertically striped back, for which it gets its name. Remember, the downy and hairy mostly have solid black on their back with a white stripe. And then they just have some white dots on the wings. They don't have that like ladder pattern. The males for the ladder-backed woodpecker and also the similar Nuttall's woodpecker have red crowns that extend from their neck to the top of their head. Again, not like that just tiny bit of red on the back of the head like the Downy and the Hairy. Nuttall's woodpecker also has a lot of black speckling on its belly that the Harrys and Downies don't have. A final similar species is a three-toed woodpecker. If you can't count, the woodpecker's toes, I don't blame you. That's probably really hard to do. The three-toed woodpecker has finely black and white barred sides, and that differentiates from just kind of the white dots of the Downy and Hairy. And finally, the male three-toed woodpeckers have yellow on their forehead, so, you're not going to mix that up at all with Downy and Harrys. Now, I mentioned that Downy and Harrys look a lot alike, and there's an evolutionary reason for that, which I'll talk about later on in the show, but there are a few ways to tell them apart. The first is just body size. The hairy woodpecker is about the size of a robin, while the Downy is only slightly bigger than a sparrow. In fact, the Downy is the smallest woodpecker species in North America. Unless you're literally looking at a Downy woodpecker and hairy side by side, though, it's hard, especially when you're starting off birding, to tell them apart by size. Once you get more used to it, you have more cues to kind of compare. But to start off, it's very difficult. Like, is that a Downy? Is that a hairy? I don't know. What's big? What's small? And then also, you deal with, there's juvenile hairy woodpeckers that might be as small as a Downy. And then sometimes there's pretty big Downy woodpeckers that are the size of a usual hairy. And also, if you have a hard time remembering which one's bigger, the Downy or the hairy, just remember that Downy, Downy's cute, like it's fuzzy, it's small. Hairy, that's big, hairy, stinky. It's it's the bigger one. What I found is the best way to differentiate them is looking at the beak. The Downy has a short bill. It's really almost a disgrace to the woodpecker family. It doesn't have that classic big hammering bill. Its bill is small, only about a third of the size of its head. The hairy, on the other hand, has a typical woodpecker bill that's at least half the length of its head, if not bigger. You can also look at the tail. The hairy woodpecker has a long and entirely black tail, while the Downy has a proportionally shorter tail that has white outer tail feathers with white spots on it. Also, the hairy tends to use its tail more. It'll prop itself back on its tail. The Downy's tail being kind of smaller, it does still support itself with it, but not as much as the hairy does. I've also read about their head shape. I don't know too much about bird phrenology, but the Downy sort of has a rounded head that is pointed in the front like an oval on its side, while the hairy woodpecker has a more boxy head. I've seen this listed in books as a way to tell them apart. I don't really appreciate it. I use the beak. So just try that. Look at the beak, be like, oh, is it at least as big as half its head? No, it's a Downy. The other way to tell them apart is by their call. Not only do these birds have similar plumage, but they do have similar calls. They both make short, sharp peep calls and also a rattle call. You'll also hear that rattle call called a whinny. The way to tell their calls apart, of course, practice listening to them, but also remember that Downy, small, cute thing again. The Downy's peep call is more high-pitched and squeaky. Compared to the hairy, slightly more baritone peep. The same goes for the rattle or whinny call, with the Downies being more high-pitched than the hairies. You'll also notice the hairy woodpecker has a down pitch right at the end of its whinny call. You'll also hear these woodpeckers drum, banging on the trees. So drumming while loud isn't actually the woodpecker trying to peck into the wood or forage for bugs or dig a nesting cavity. It's actually the woodpecker using the resonant wood of the tree for communication, just like the way songbirds sing to attract mates and defend territory. Basically, they're drumming, they're using the tree like a drum. In fact, studies of the forebrain brain nuclei that control drumming behavior in woodpeckers show that they are analogous to the forebrain nuclei of songbirds that control their singing behavior. They drum really fast. The Downy woodpecker has been recorded on high-speed video drumming 16 to 23 times a second. Here's the Downy woodpecker drumming. And here's the hairy woodpecker drumming. Experiments have shown faster drumming is associated with more antagonistic encounters, such as when a rival woodpecker is encroaching on another's territory. Also, faster drumming appears to be more effective in deterring other woodpeckers from engaging in actual physical violence. Drumming 20 times a second takes a lot of energy and motor coordination, so being able to drum fast is likely a fitness signal to others, and is basically a woodpecker flexing its muscles. When feeding or excavating, they use much slower, more deliberate pecks that aren't as loud. Woodpeckers appear to be able to tell their own species' drums apart and don't really react to other woodpeckers drumming, according to a 2001 study out of California Polytechnic State University. So, as far as their names, the Downy woodpecker, its scientific name is Dryobates pubescens. Dryobates is actually probably one of the cooler genus names I've talked about in the show for a while. It's formed from the ancient Greek words drus, meaning woods, and bates, meaning walker. So it means woodland walkers. This is perfect for a bird that literally walks on trees. I love that, woodland walkers. It sounds like a slightly more like hippie version of the White Walkers from Game of Thrones. Like instead of zombies, they're just like really stoned, like walking towards you. And yes, I can't ignore the fact that the genus name pubescens has pubes in it, for all you immature listeners, har. But there's a reason for the pubes. Pubescens in Latin literally means to become hairy or to obtain down feathers. So it's just sort of a Latinization of the word downy. With the Downy woodpecker being sort of the smaller, cuter version of the hairy woodpecker, I think this genus name is especially apt. Pubescens, pubes, the Downy woodpecker is just sort of a awkward teenager that's just starting to undergo puberty. The hairy woodpecker's scientific name is a little bit of a mouthful. Leuconotopicus villosus. Leuconotopicus is a combination of the ancient Greek word leukos, meaning white, nodon, meaning back, and picos, meaning woodpecker. So just the unimaginative white-backed woodpecker. The species name villosus is similarly unimaginative, just being the Latin word for hairy or full of hair. And you'll notice while both these birds look very similar, they have different genus names. More on that in the evolution section, but spoiler alert, they are not actually closely related, and their similarity is due to convergent evolution. They're not brothers, but more of cousins that just evolved to look alike. And there's a lot of controversy with the genus names and the taxonomy of woodpeckers. I'm going to kind of just go with some of the most recent papers that I read, but if you look at eBird, you'll see that hairy woodpeckers and downy woodpeckers are both in the genus Dryobates. It all comes down to if you're a lumper or a splitter, and apparently eBird, they're lumpers. But we'll be kind of splitters on the show today. As far as their range and habitat, you'll find both these birds throughout the continental U.S. and far up into Canada, basically extending to the tundra. When the trees stop, the woodpeckers stop. If there's no wood to peck, you know what they're going to do. The hairy woodpecker has a slightly larger range, with populations extending into Mexico and Central America along the woodlands of the Sierra Madre Occidental. Hairy woodpeckers can also be found in the Bahamas. Hairies do not migrate per se, but they do move seasonally. The very northernmost populations do move to less snow-covered areas during the winter, but these birds are by no means shy of some snow. They just need to be able to get to the bark of the trees and can't feed if those trees are totally buried in snow. They also will tend to move down mountaintops and into valleys during the winter, and also towards the coast where temperatures may be more mild and stable during the winter. Downies are much more sedentary than hairies, but will also sometimes move during the winter to more favorable conditions. Female downies appear to be more likely to disperse than males, and this dispersal of females could be important for gene flow within the populations of downy woodpeckers. Oh, here's some cardinals. As far as the habitat you'll find them in, both these birds rely on a good supply of mature trees for them to find their food and also to provide breeding sites. While they don't need trees near as big as pileated woodpeckers do for making their nest holes in, they still need trees of a reasonable size. A study conducted near Blacksburg, Virginia found that downy woodpeckers need trees that measure 20 centimeters or 8 inches in diameter at breast height, and hairy need 30 centimeters or 12 inches. So these birds are commonly found in mature forests and also suburban environments and broken woodlots that just have lots of mature trees. Hairy woodpeckers, being bigger, seem to prefer larger trees and snags if they can find them. There's some trains coming through Buchanan. It's a train town, and there's lots of trains, so we're just going to keep going. There's lots of bird calls, though. There's like lots of woodpeckers, and I'm hearing some towhees, too. I did hear some turkeys gobbling. They only did it like once, though. Maybe they'll do it again. A study conducted in 2015 to 2016 in Portland, Oregon, looked at urban and suburban green spaces and found downy woodpeckers seem to be able to thrive in green spaces as small as 1.3 hectares or 3 acres, while hairies required at least 10 hectares or 24 acres. But that's just sort of for, to maintain a minimal size of the population. Hairy woodpeckers will feed across a much wider range. A study done in northwestern Washington found hairy woodpecker home range was around 64 hectares or 128 acres in size. And speaking of feeding, everyone knows woodpeckers eat bugs, but the downy and hairies both have specialized niches on the bugs they eat. There's sort of 4 major feeding behaviors woodpeckers use to catch prey. Percussion, where they literally hammer into the tree to locate the bugs. Scaling, where they move up and down a tree and pause to snatch up food that they find. This is also called gleaning. Peering and poking, which occurs. They look in holes, cracks, and crevices and bark on the trees. And finally, fly catching. Pretty crazy that woodpeckers will catch bugs out of the air with their bills, too. They usually only do this when bugs are highly concentrated, such as around sap on a tree. Hairy woodpeckers are more likely to forage on tree trunks, while downy woodpeckers forage on tree limbs. And downy woodpeckers tend to prefer feeding on live tree limbs over dead ones. They also can more often be found feeding low on the trees and close to the ground, while hairies are usually higher up on the trees. Downy woodpeckers mostly feed by the scaling technique, where they will search for bugs, larvae, or eggs that they can glean from the bark and crevices of the tree. While hairy woodpeckers with their bigger bills are more adept to percussion feeding and hammering into the tree in search of bugs. They will also sometimes follow their big cousin, the pileated woodpecker, around the forest and further probe into the big holes made by the pileated to find bugs that the pileated might have missed. Its giant bill isn't as precise as the smaller bill of the hairy woodpecker. Downy woodpeckers are often found in mixed flocks, especially in the winter. I usually find them along the tail end of a mixed flock. Mixed flocks, it's usually led by titmice and chickadees, and then you might have some nuthatches behind, and then usually I see like the downy woodpecker. Hairy woodpeckers sometimes are with mixed flocks, but not as often. Then I usually see the downy woodpecker, and usually the caboose is usually the creeper, the brown creeper that I see. Downies will also preferentially feed on smaller trees with smaller diameters, while hairy woodpeckers will exploit large diameter trees. And just to show how small downies are, they're able to land on tall weeds or cattails and hammer into seed pods and look for bugs. So like a freaking tall weed is basically a tree to a downy woodpecker. That's how small and cute they are. So those are kind of the, separate niches. Even though these birds occur together, they look a lot alike, they feed differently, and this allows them to coexist. Downies don't just eat bugs. A study of downy stomach contents from 1911 found 76% animal matter such as caterpillars, ants, and beetles in their stomach, but 24% plant matter such as seeds and fruit. Hairy woodpeckers will also eat fruit and seeds, with it sometimes making up 20% of their diet. Downy woodpeckers are known predators of the invasive bug species, the emerald ash borer. And the hairy woodpecker is a known predator of orchard pests like the codling moth. Hairy woodpeckers feed their nestlings 60% wood-boring beetle larvae and ant larvae, with larvae of other insects making up the majority of the rest of their diet. They feed only a small amount of adult bugs like spiders, caterpillars, and moths to their nestlings. There is one exception from a study conducted in Catitas and Yakima counties in Washington. Shout out to Zach out there in Yakima. Hairy woodpeckers were observed provisioning their nestlings with 13% adult beetles. Presumably, these adult beetles were captured while the hairy woodpeckers were excavating their boreholes, looking for their larvae, and then opportunistically captured the adults also. Both downy woodpeckers and hairy will take suet from feeders, and both species will also exploit sap wells made by the sapsucker woodpeckers. And downy woodpeckers, again showing how small and petite they are, have even been observed drinking from hummingbird feeders. So that's the feeding. Let's go into the breeding of these birds. The courtship rituals of the downy woodpeckers involve a flight with slow wing beats between the male and female. The flight looks much different from the usual undulating flight pattern of woodpeckers, and it's been compared to looking like butterflies in flight. Hairy woodpeckers perform their courtship ritual on the tree trunk, craning back their necks and bobbing their heads from side to side as they flick their wings and go in a circle around the trunk. They do sort of a weird little woodpecker dance. These birds are primary cavity nesters, meaning that they hammer out their own nest cavities every year. In fact, they may even excavate a few holes and then choose which one they like best. This makes them super important for secondary cavity nesters that nest in tree cavities but can't excavate them from themselves, especially the smaller species like titmice, chickadees, and nuthatches. The little nesting cavities of downy woodpeckers appear to be especially important for red-breasted nuthatches, who are found to increase their population in years following downy woodpeckers nesting in the same area. Sometimes the secondary cavity nesters are a little too eager to move into the woodpecker cavities, though, and don't wait for the woodpeckers to move out first. In 2015, in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest of Washington State, a pair of mountain bluebirds was observed evicting an active hairy woodpecker nest. Male and female downy woodpeckers will excavate their nests together. I assume the same is true for the hairies. They require that the trees they are nesting in to either be dead or have disease, causing the wood to be softened up. Remember that the downy woodpeckers kind of have that very small bill. I called them a disgrace to the woodpecker family earlier. I'm sorry for that, downies. A lot of times downies will make their nests on a live tree, but with a snag, which is a broken off tree branch that's still hanging on but is dead. So it's easy for the woodpeckers to exploit. And, it's on a live tree, so it's kind of safe. You're not worried about the tree falling down. Hairy woodpeckers do have a tendency to make their nesting cavities, though, in actual live trees. This is a possible defensive measure against nest predators who would have a harder time chewing through live tree wood to get at the nest, than dead wood, which they would be able to chew away pretty easily. Hairy woodpeckers will also often position their nesting hole facing downwards, which presumably makes it harder for mammals to access. The excavation of the hole takes 1 to 3 weeks for the downy woodpecker and around 2 weeks for the hairy. Downies will sometimes nest in the walls of houses. I've actually witnessed this before when I was in medical school in Lewisburg, West Virginia at the osteopathic school, the O school as they call it. I was studying one time in the backyard of one of my friends, and we were watching the house across from us. There was a downy woodpecker pair that was literally hammering a hole in their wood siding and making a nesting hole. Woodpeckers are generally monogamous with high parental investment in their young. However, extra pair copulations have been observed in the Downy woodpecker. In 1999, along the Wabash River in Tippecanoe County, Indiana, a banded female Downy woodpecker was observed to have 2 male Downy woodpeckers that she entertained. Both these males had appeared to court her in the spring, and she began excavating a nest with one of them. She successfully laid eggs and began caring for them with this male. However, she was observed copulating with the other male when she was away from the nest. In fact, this female Downy had a whole second life with this other male, and they excavated their own separate nesting cavity together. This second nesting attempt, though, does not appear to have been successful. The nesting hole appeared to be abandoned within a few weeks. Really interesting and rare case of polyandry in the bird world. Usually you see more it's the males that are stepping out. I won't make any comparison to humans. But anyway, this mother bird may have just bitten off a little more than she could chew trying to have 2 families. The inside of the nesting hole for both these birds is mostly bare. It's lined only with wood chips from the excavation. And they make the entrance, just small enough for them to enter, but it's a little bit bigger on the inside. And making it small on the outside helps prevent nest predators. Ooh, a little bit of wind. Hairy woodpeckers lay 3 to 6 eggs, and the Downy lays 3 to 8. After about 12 days, the eggs of both species hatch. The hairy woodpecker male and females appear to split the feeding duties with the nestlings equally. The hairy woodpecker nestlings take slightly longer to fledge than the Downy. The Downy woodpecker nestlings fledge after about 21 days, while the hairies take closer to a month. I really didn't see much about, if they feed the nestlings after they leave the nest. I assume they do. Most birds do this, like for at least a week. They'll help feed their juveniles, while they're learning the ropes and learning how to feed and everything. And yeah, while these birds are common, while they're widespread, and while there has generally been a lot of study about their habits and everything, I didn't find as much information on them as I do on some of the bird species that I research. I didn't find a ton about diseases or parasites of the Downy and Hairy Woodpecker. Again, usually I find a lot of stuff about West Nile and studies of their droppings and what intestinal parasites they have. I really didn't find much of this with them. But anyway, they have a survival ratio kind of similar to a lot of songbirds. A study conducted in central Wisconsin between 2006 and 2013 found 51% and 52% annual survival for Downy and Hairy woodpeckers, respectively. Black bears are known predators of woodpecker nests, including hairy woodpeckers. Downy woodpeckers usually nest in trees or snags that are too small to support black bears' weight, so they're less likely to be preyed upon. But the nestlings of both species are prone to predation by the usual mammalian predators, raccoons and squirrels in particular. Adults are preyed upon by the usual songbird hunting hawks, sharp-shinned, and Cooper's hawks. I actually have a cool story. So my wife and I at our house here in Buchanan, not too long after we moved in, of course I set up some bird feeders, and I have a nice one right in front of our kitchen window that we love to watch the birds on. And it was a morning, we're drinking coffee, we're kind of watching the birds, and all of a sudden the birds clear out, it was really quick, and I see a hawk, and it lands in the tree nearby. And I noticed that on the feeder right by the window is a male Downy woodpecker, just paralyzed with fear, oh shit, I didn't fly away fast enough. I hope he doesn't see me. And the hawk doesn't really notice him at first. He's preening and stuff. He's oh shit, I scared away all the birds. But then he sees him, and the Downy is oh my God, you can just see the wheels churning in his head, him trying to decide what to do. And he decides to fly and try to get away. And that hawk was so fast. The moment the Downy started flying away, hawk just swooped down, grabbed him, took him back to the tree. You could see the poor little male flapping as the hawk just digs his talons in it. And then he had a meal, and I felt bad, but hawks got to eat, right? And man, That Downy he was busy eating, he wasn't paying attention. The good news is, even with those hungry hawks, the population of both Downy and hairy woodpeckers is stable. Downy woodpecker population is estimated at 13 million and hairy woodpecker is estimated at 8.9 million. Wildfires are likely important to hairy and downy woodpeckers. Wildfires, while they can be devastating, are a natural part of a healthy woodland ecosystem. They create dead trees and also weaken still living trees, making them more prone to bark beetle infestations and fungal infestations, which, is important for woodpeckers. It's no surprise that hairy woodpeckers are more abundant in burned pine forests compared to unburned pine forests. This boost in hairy woodpecker population after burns seems to last for 4 to 7 years after the wildfire occurs. And while downy and hairy woodpeckers rely on dead and diseased trees for their nests and food sources, they're actually an important part of keeping a forest healthy. I already talked about how they eat invasive species such as the emerald ash borer. They also keep native insect species in check. In western Colorado, we're estimated to have reduced spruce beetle broods by 70 to 79%. That's huge. This predation helps delay the beetles' destruction of trees and also reduces their spread to others. This isn't just important from a tree perspective. From an economic perspective, woodpeckers are important. Lumber that is riddled with beetle holes is much less valuable. So woodpeckers are important not just for, healthy, awesome forests, but also for the economy. So protect woodpeckers if you want a higher GDP. Come on, people. Downy and hairy woodpeckers are pretty long-lived birds for their size. The oldest known downy woodpecker was 11 years, 11 months old when it was recaptured in California in 1996. The oldest known hairy woodpecker was 15 years, 11 months old when it was recaptured in New York in 2010. All right, y'all, so let's wrap up talking about the evolutionary history of these birds. I talk about woodpecker evolution in my pileated, ivory-billed woodpecker episode, my emperor woodpecker episode, my red-bellied woodpecker episode, so check that out for more woodpecker evolutionary history as a whole. The woodpecker family, Pisidiae, is most closely related to the honeyguides and barbets. The family can be further broken down into clades, one of which is the wrynecks that contains only 2 species of very primitive-seeming woodpeckers located in Europe and Africa. Since the honeyguides, barbets, and wrynecks are all located in the Old World, it is likely that the woodpecker family also originated there. And it's pretty well thought of that they're part of the Afro-Aves radiation of birds, out of Africa. The other clade of Pisidiae is the piculates, which are basically the hummingbirds of the woodpecker world, being these small-bodied birds of the tropics. Piculates originate from at least 24 million years ago and also show the woodpecker family has spread out of the Old World to the New World by then, based on a piculate fossil found preserved in amber on the Caribbean islands and dating from the early Miocene. The last and largest clade of Pisidiae is your typical woodpeckers called Pisciinae. It has undergone countless taxonomic revisions over the years. I'm not going into those nuances. Within Pisciinae, there are several tribes. Our hairy and downy woodpeckers are within the tribe called Melanurpinae. And this Melanurpinae tribe is further divided into its own clades. So there's just a lot of splitting going on here. Sometimes I like the lumpers, the lumpers just make it easy. But, the splitters are probably, more precise and right most of the time. Within that clade Melanurpinae, there are 3 sister genuses. Vanilliornis, that contains woodpeckers in Central and South America, Dryobates, that contains our downy woodpecker, and Leuconotopicus, that contains the hairy woodpecker. The last common ancestor of the hairy and downy woodpeckers was about 8 million years ago, when these 3 sister genuses split. The downy woodpecker is sister species to Nuttall's woodpecker and the ladder-backed woodpecker. One doomed tree of life has them splitting about 5.5 million years ago. Both these woodpeckers are sort of desert specialist versions of the downy woodpecker, and while Nuttall's woodpecker and the ladder-backed woodpecker hybridize with each other, I did not find anything about the downy woodpecker hybridizing with its sister species. The hairy woodpecker is sister species with Strickland's woodpecker and the Arizona woodpecker, both of which are also desert specialists. This is according to a paper that tackled the phylogeny of all the woodpeckers and tries to make a tree using genetic data of hundreds of woodpecker species. It differs a bit from the one-zoom tree of life splits, but one-zoom tree of life has the hairy woodpecker differentiating from the rest of its genus at around 3 million years ago. I think it's interesting that both the sister species for the downy and the hairy are desert specialists. I guess it kind of shows that the downy and hairy are more generalists to just woodlands, and that the other species that formed kind of off of their common ancestor adapted to very specific niches, which were deserts. The populations of downy and hairy woodpeckers have likely experienced multiple cycles of population contraction and expansion during periods of glacial advancement and then retreat over the past 500,000 years, and particularly during the last glacial maximum 21,000 years ago, where they were restricted entirely to southern refugia. Phylogeographical studies suggest that there wasn't just one area of refugia for these populations, but likely multiple different ones separated by impassable glacial ice sheets. Despite these instances of bottlenecking, both downy and hairy woodpeckers appear to have been able to maintain population sizes large enough to preserve a lot of genetic diversity in their genomes. The Alaska population of downy woodpeckers shows a very low genetic diversity, suggesting the founder effect from recent colonization. In fact, using mutation rate analysis, it appears downy woodpeckers colonized Alaska within the past 7,000 years. Humans came around 15,000 years ago. So there originally were no downy woodpeckers when the first humans crossed the, Bering Strait and came into America. That's crazy. So why do hairy and downy woodpeckers look alike even though they're not even in the same genus? So one hypothesis is that downy woodpeckers evolved similar plumage to hairy woodpeckers in order to avoid intraspecies aggression from the hairy woodpeckers and allow them to better exploit food sources. The theory here being that if the hairy thinks the downy is the same species as it, it is less likely to chase it off and will share food. However, as most bird watchers know, birds seem to show even more aggression towards members of their own species than they do to other species, likely because they're all competing for the same food niche. And in practice, this theory falls apart too. A study published in Animal Behavior in 2018 that looked at multiple bird species dominance and submissive behaviors found hairy woodpeckers were consistently dominant and aggressive to downies. Starlings, red-bellied woodpeckers, and blue jays were also all dominant to downies, while goldfinches, titmice, chickadees, and nuthatches were submissive. These submissive birds may actually support the other theory on downy-hairy convergence plumage. This theory states that downies aren't trying to fool hairy woodpeckers, they're trying to fool other bird species into thinking that they are hairy woodpeckers. And they will submit and allow them easier access to food because they just automatically assume, oh, that's a hairy woodpecker, it's big. Downies are able to get all the advantage of having a big body size without actually spending the energy to maintain a big body size. It's sort of like you're tiny, but you dress like the Incredible Hulk, and people just assume you're the Incredible Hulk, I guess, because you look like him. I don't know if that makes any sense. This theory does seem to be the one that makes more sense, when you think about it. It makes it more plausible how the downies would mimic plumage for the hairy woodpecker, and it would be evolutionary selected for. But astute listeners might notice that according to One Zoom Tree of Life, I just said that the downy woodpecker evolved 5.5 million years ago, and the hairy evolved 3 million years ago. So what gives? How did the downy woodpecker form its distinct plumage off of a bird that wasn't even evolved yet? Well, of course, evolutionary times are all just estimates. Really those predictions of when they're splitting off from other birds, it's just about when the last common ancestor was. And we all know that birds are not static. Our talk about subspecies that we've done on the show, birds are constantly changing. So just because the downy woodpecker split from its sister species 5 million years ago, and the hairy woodpecker appears to have split from its sister species 3 million years ago, there's obviously a lot of things that could have happened within that past 2 million years ago. Species don't just come into the world, fully formed and stay the same. Everything is always changing. Speaking of subspecies, the hairy has a ton. There's between 17 and 21 subspecies of hairy woodpecker. A paper I read that looked at the genetics of the subspecies found that some of them aren't genetically supported as being distinctly different. Again, subspecies, it's lumper splitter argument. I won't go into detail about each individual subspecies, but I do want to point out a few highlights. In general, the white parts of the plumage on hairy woodpeckers become grayer and even rufous or brown as you move to the west and also the southwest. Compared to the east, their underparts are more, white as snow. Genetic studies have found 5 major clades of hairy woodpeckers that all have very little gene flow between the clades. The 5 clades are geographically based on the Pacific coast, the Rocky Mountains to Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains, the rest of Mexico that excludes the Sierra Madre Occidental, southern Central America, and finally boreal and eastern U.S. The last clade is huge because it pretty much covers, all of the eastern U.S. and all of Canada except for the Rocky Mountains. Each of these 5 clades likely represents 5 different areas of refugia for the hairy woodpecker during the last glacial maximum. There's an interesting wrinkle in this evolutionary history of hairy woodpeckers, though. Off the coast of British Columbia, there is a morphologically distinct subspecies of hairy woodpecker called the Queen Charlotte Island subspecies. Mitochondrial analysis actually suggests this species may be a holdover from when the clades of the southwest were more widespread and colonized the island. Then during glacial advances, while the mainland hairy woodpeckers retreated to refugia, the Queen Charlotte Islands remained ice-free and allowed the population of hairy woodpeckers there to stay. Later, when hairy woodpeckers recolonized the mainland when the ice sheets retreated, they actually came from the boreal and eastern U.S. clade. So it's kind of cool, the Queen Charlotte Island woodpeckers that are there and are kind of their own distinct subspecies, they're not even closely related to the subspecies that's on the land. It came from a whole different part of the country from different colonization events during the whole glacial advance and retreat. There's 7 subspecies of Downy woodpecker. I don't really have, any exciting stories about island glacial colonizations for them. But I will end the show talking about Bergmann's rule. I love Bergmann's and Allen's rule. Everyone knows that. And the hairy and downy woodpeckers follow Bergmann's rule. They have larger body sizes further north. Larger body size means you need less energy to maintain heat. So it makes energy evolutionary sense. And guys, that's the show. That's about downy and hairy woodpeckers. These are really cool birds. They're fun to watch. They're easy to find. Get acquainted with their calls. You'll definitely hear that whinny call is like an alarm call. You'll definitely hear it when you're walking through the woods. And it's fun learning how to differentiate them because you'll sound like a bird expert when you're able to say, oh, that's a hairy woodpecker, not a downy woodpecker. Oh, based on the bill size, yeah. And the call. It's much more baritone than soprano. As always, y'all, please reach out. Let me know. You guys keep me doing the show. I'm hoping to get to 100 episodes. And if you guys write in, send me your bird watches, ask me to send you some free stickers, I'm happy to do it. And that will help me keep making the show and get to 100. So as always, stay dirty, fellow birdies. Dirty Bird Podcast is brought to you by me, John, with my rotating panel of guests and co-hosts. Thanks for being on the show, everybody. The Dirty Bird theme song is by Ricky Pistone. Check out his groovy and hilarious music videos on YouTube. The outro music you're listening to right now is a song New York Redneck by the Sidewalk Slammers. Check them out wherever you get your music. The Dirty Bird Podcast logo is by the very talented TJ Ranoski. And of course, a shout out to my beautiful wife, Lauren, who created my original logo. Check out the show notes for this episode for a full list of credits for any bird calls or sounds used in the episode. Thanks for listening.
At the track, driving to Brooklyn, ain't never coming back. Tim's on the ground in the concrete jungle. I'm